Welcome back to another episode of Profitless on Purpose, the nonprofit accounting podcast, not just from one accountant's perspective. I'm one of your hosts, AJ Wheeler. With me this week is Mark Pallardy.
Hey, everyone.
And back for another week, we didn't scare him off too bad, is Tony Cajigas.
Hey, guys, I'm still here.
Got a good episode this week. We'll go over some articles. First article up is actually 2021 tax deduction for charitable donations is changing. Did you know about it? Most of us didn't until we read the article, but we'll talk about it so you don't have to read into that stuff and how it's going to change and what they're doing with it or what they're proposing. Then we have an article about how much control universities have over their donations from large donors. What should be the policy? What's been the problem in the past? What's probably wrong with the article? We'll talk about all of it. I'm sure Mark has an opinion on it. And our last article for the week is gift acceptance policies, kind of a follow-up to our university question, but like what should policies be around accepting donations, grants, contracts? What are the do's and don'ts, the no-fly zones for your donation policy? What should it be? Should you even have a donation policy? We'll talk about all of it in just a bit. And then our do's and don'ts series continues this week. And our do's and don'ts for this week is risk assessment. It's not just all about insurance, people. We'll talk about the do's and don'ts around your risk assessment. How often should you do it? What should you consider? We'll get into all of it this week. But up first, I think, is Mark. Mark, you got our first article for us?
Yeah, my first article is called Some Donors May Get a Smaller Than Expected Tax Deduction for 2021 Charitable Gifts. And this comes from CNBC. And it's an interesting article. It goes a little bit into tax policy and how charitable deductions have been handled in the past, and then how things have changed with the CARES Act. Basically, when the Trump tax changes happened at the beginning part of his administration and itemized deductions went way up, it meant that a lot of people who were getting charitable deductions on their, itemized schedules were no longer, there was no longer a big financial benefit to giving to charities and nonprofits, because all of a sudden a lot of people fell into categories where they could take an itemized deduction. So in the CARES Act, one of the things that started to shift was that they said, well, even if you itemize, you can still take $300 individually or $600 as a couple as a charitable deduction. And the thing that's most recently changed, and I think it's with I don't know if it's gone into effect yet or not. It's a 2021 draft of what's going to be happening here, is that the charitable write-off deduction is no longer above the line, but it's not an itemized deduction either. So that's a lot of complicated tax speak. But what that means is that your adjusted gross income, which is used for all sorts of things, student loans, qualifying for specific programs federally, the AGI prior to that with the $300 program was affected. And now that it's kind of in this no man's land where it's not an itemized deduction. And this article posits that in this no man's land, there are going to be some winners and losers, specifically people who are on Medicaid might have some, things that are with their AGI not changing. They're going to have things that are affected by this. And basically, this article is suggesting that this makes it more confusing for taxpayers. I mean, here I am, an accountant, and it's confusing for me, right? So married taxpayers who file can be worse off as a result of this. But at the same time, the author says he doesn't expect this to change charitable giving in the year 2021. Now, I think this is an important article because it kind of is a little looking under the hood to see how the sausage is made. But it also is kind of a tweak to the tax policy that I don't know that anybody's going to notice if you're not a real policy wonk or really concerned about this sort of stuff. So I guess my questions that I want to pose to you guys in reading this, do you think that this is going to have any impact on giving overall? And do you think that the average person who this affects is even paying attention to above the line versus below the line deductions?
I have to say, I usually kind of stay up on, I'm not a tax guy, right? But I usually stay up on this kind of stuff, especially when it relates to charitable giving. And this was something that completely went under my radar, and I wasn't even aware of this. So I don't think the vast majority of people out there are even aware of this. I mean, charitable deductions have started changing since the first year Trump was in office, when, like the whole charitable deduction and actually the whole itemized deduction and standard deduction changed. And a lot of people went away from being able to file with the itemized deduction and just moved to a standard deduction. And back then, everybody was thinking that was going to drastically reduce the amount of charitable giving. And we did see a shift to more of those donor advised funds where, you kind of get more bang for your buck. And we've talked about it on a podcast before. If you want to dig into the archives, we've beaten donor advised funds to death, but that was supposedly supposed to be the wave of the future. But I really think with this kind of new implementation and this like kind of proposed idea of it being in between, above the line or in this like third category, and then not, it's not above the line, it's not an itemized deduction, but it's this weird other kind of deduction that doesn't affect AGI, but somehow affects tax paid. I think nobody's really going to know until they produce their tax returns. But the flip side of this is that the amounts that are listed are so small that I really don't think it's going to move the needle as far as donations go. And I think we saw the same thing happen when the tax change of the standard deduction moving away from, making more people advantageous to do a standard deduction than an itemized deduction and moving less people out of that long form filing. It really didn't affect giving that much. And maybe it affected where the giving was coming from or how it was being perceived, how it was being generated to the nonprofit or where it was coming from. But to be honest with you, I think this is more of like a personal tax thing that people are going to figure out when they, do their taxes for 2021. And it's not something I think that's on the radar, especially because of the dollar threshold, right? We're only talking $300 or whatever it is that you're eligible for. And to be fair, long filers that have enough interest and mortgage interest and stuff to make itemized, you're probably still in the same position there. You're probably looking at the same kind of itemized deduction for your charitable donations as you were before. So yeah, I don't know if this is going to move the needle, but it's definitely interesting. It's definitely not something I had on my radar. What do you think, Tony?
Yeah. My thoughts were similar to yours, AJ. But I know the author discussed it may not have an effect on donors. But I mean, I feel once people understand they may not actually get a tax benefit, it may, they may not give as much or as often as they did in the past. And as far as people paying attention, I mean, I was unaware of this also, like you said, but I think personally over these last few years and everything that's going on in the world, I feel like more people are actually paying attention to things out there now. As far as people getting into the tax code and stuff, I don't know about that. But as far as paying more attention, economically and what's going on out there, and the CARES Act and so on and so forth. So that's what I think.
Yeah, and I think this kind of feels to me like some sort of pencil on the back of a napkin. Like, oh crap, I got to make this budget balance. Where can I get $300 million? Oh, we'll just throw this thing so it's not included in AGI and we'll make it in no man's land, right? So it's one of these things that some policy wonk decided to do to balance some book or something. I mean, obviously, I don't know the history behind this, and maybe I'm being a little cynical here, but who does this really benefit, right? It's $300 for a single person or $600, for a couple. And this to me kind of brings up in my mind that the whole idea of charitable deductions being an itemized deduction, it's a great incentive for those who are already itemizing to give, but it's also a disincentive for those who are not itemizing to give. I mean, obviously, you're giving to a nonprofit, hopefully for the right reasons, right? Because you believe in the mission and the vision. But do you think hiding charitable deductions in an itemized deduction, so anybody who's taking a standard doesn't really gain a lot of benefit, is the way to go? Is the right way to do this?
Yeah, it's a good question, because I think, like, if we're talking like class status, or at least like income status, right? Itemized deductions have always kind of been, usually to qualify, you'd have to own a home. If we're being completely honest, like the mortgage interest and the all that stuff, and the property taxes you're paying on your home is usually what puts you into that itemized group. And so you're talking about somebody that's, usually upper middle class, as a barrier to entry for itemized, to be able to itemize. And so, to be honest, like charitable deductions being a part of itemized deductions, like, people that are making good income, or, a high earner, are going to, usually benefit from these things more so than like somebody with less income or in that lower income bracket. So removing it from removing charitable deductions and putting it somewhere else on the tax return, like it was done in 2020 as an above the line, kind of like student interest, I think would possibly help, people in that lower tax brackets to maybe incentivize them to make donations, but I don't necessarily know that it would show in anything. I think people usually give because they're going to give. And I don't necessarily know if a tax policy is going to, push them over the edge to make a $300 donation to the Salvation Army before the end of the year, or if anybody ever thinks that way. You can use the example of IRAs, right? They've been trying to use IRAs as incentive for people to stock away savings. And I used to file low income tax returns for free through the VITA program for low income individuals through the IRS free program. And you would always, and you even have until filing deadline, until you file your taxes, to stash away money from last month to take that, deduction on your tax. Nobody would take advantage of it in that lower tax bracket. It's just because they don't have the money to be able to do so. Even as a medium and, upper echelon, earner, I don't necessarily know that the IRA deduction really pushes anybody for retirement savings. And I have to believe the same thing is true with either above the line or below the line, or however they're giving you a tax break for charitable donations. I think the vast majority of the populace just hears that they're going to get a tax break, or that their donation is, a tax deductible donation, and they think they're, going to get something out of it, and they donate. So I think from a marketing standpoint, it's great, but from an actual tax policy and incentivizing people to invest in nonprofits or to make these charitable donations, I don't necessarily know it moves the needle, whether it's above the line, below the line, in between, wherever it is, so. But I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong here, but
yeah, I don't think it would be a good idea to itemize it, owing to the fact that I don't believe many people itemize unless they're, like AJ said, homeowners and have several other deductions, medical examples, and stuff like that. But I don't think that would be a good idea.
All right, Tony, I think you have our next article.
I do. The name of the article is "How Much Control Do University Donors Have Over Their Gift?" So this was a short and sweet article, but very informative, and made you think a lot about what control donors have when it comes to making large donations. So some of the examples they give in this article is, so there was a $20 donation to Yale to endow 11 professorships in a new program on Western civilization. But later, the donation was returned after Yale did not do anything to construct the program. There was another example in 1993. A David Merger redirected a $3 million donation to Boston University that they claimed was somehow lost, which was interesting. And the meat and potatoes of the article was in reference to a Walter Hussman, who donated $25 million to the University of North Carolina and I believe this was actually on the national news recently, and he disputed a tenureship of Nicole Hannah Jones due to the fact that Miss Jones wanted to work with the 619 Project, who this Hussman gentleman kind of did not agree with. So some of the questions I would pose to you guys are, are schools actually, are they at the mercy of these large donors? And also, would the schools jeopardize their mission in accepting some of these large donations? And then also, where do you believe the line should be drawn as far as giving say to these donors? So what do you guys think?
Yeah, I thought this was a really good article, Tony, and I really like your questions related to it, because I think this goes beyond just a university setting, right? It kind of, and we'll get into another article here after this that I think really expands on this idea. But I think, I guess in my thought, when you are receiving a donation that somebody wants restricted, and we're talking big money here, we're talking $20+ million in all of these cases that he's citing. But realistically, it should be restricted for some kind of purpose. And I think the first example that you gave, where it was restricted for, a specific kind of program, was great. And I just don't know how Boston University had lost it to poor accounting. But I think, I think that's perfectly reasonable for somebody to give a large amount of money for that and have it restricted to a certain program. Where I really take issue with the article or with the donor's intent here is when they're prescribing how somebody runs their organization through a donation. I mean, you're talking about, restricting tenureship of a professor based on the donation that's supposed to be restricted for something else. I mean, that's kind of coming with a lot of strings attached. So I think from a nonprofit or a university standpoint, I think you really need to look at, when you're accepting these donations, what type of strings are attached, what that right of return is, because in the case of the money that was lost in bad accounting, the university should be held liable to return that money if it wasn't used for the donor intent behind it. So I really think, the key to when you're accepting these kind of donations or funds is, can you through your organization or through the school, can the restriction be met? Or are you going to have to jump through a lot of hoops that are going to cause this money to be held up in perpetuity trying to finish the mission behind it? Second, donors shouldn't be stipulating how you run your business or how you run your nonprofit. That I think is done through, public interaction, public pressure, however it may be, whatever the tone is from the top. But when you have donors, kind of stipulating who's on the payroll, how programs are actually run, and not directing the money at an end population or an end user for what it's supporting, I think you can get yourself into real trouble. Because I think those are really it's a squishy area. You can have donations restricted for timing and purpose, but when that purpose becomes who's working on the project or how that project is directed through the workflow, that's a really squishy area to where does it stop? I guess it's really a slippery slope for me. So yeah, I think it's interesting that those kind of restrictions are made. And I think really, schools are probably like, you public universities are I want to say a weird area or a different area in nonprofits where there's this kind of, like somebody gets a building named after them or whatever. There's these kind of perks and like status symbol kind of donations that are made. And so, yeah, it's interesting to say the least. And I was kind of blown away by the fact that like some of these donors would attach such restrictions to their money.
Oh boy, where to begin? No, Tony, I think it's a good article, but I think again, we seem to come across these articles that are just riddled with bias, right? So I'm going to just read you from the second line of the article. One of the thorniest problems donors have in giving to colleagues in university is what limits a donor should put on his gift. I don't know if you heard that, but only men can give big donations. Women don't, right? So already I knew exactly where this guy was probably going, and he went there in spades. He quotes super far right-wing journals as evidence, the Influence Watch, if you're curious. But he has an axe to grind, and he grinds it, maybe successfully if you buy into what he's saying, that donors should have the right to put strings on this kind of money, this kind of donation. And Mr. Hussman, who gave this money to UNC, just made a suggestion. Well, maybe she shouldn't get tenure. Maybe she should get a 5-year contract instead. And lo and behold, that's what was offered to her, until people got into an uproar and said, no way, Nicole Hannah-Jones should get tenure like everybody else. And just because he is not fond of the 1619 Project, which directly confronts racism and directly confronts the African-American experience, and he doesn't agree with what it says because he's watching a little too much Fox News, he's going to now complain and claim that he should dictate what students should be learning or not learning. And I'm sorry, it's just yet another example, and of a white guy, guilty as charged, telling the African-American woman what her experience should be and what she should or shouldn't teach in the classroom. I think it's wrong. And I think Hussman should have backed away. And I get really animated about this because I worked in a museum where there was some difficult topics of racism that came up, where I firsthand was made aware that some of the high value, high donor base, who happened to all be white males, were trying to dictate what the content was and said, hey, lay off of the white man. They weren't so bad. And I'm sorry, let's give a full picture of history. Luckily, the museum held their ground and said, no, you don't dictate to us what happened here. Unfortunately, the University of North Carolina did not react that way. And as a result, Hannah Nicole Jones went to another university where she was welcomed, where the Knight Foundation and others endowed her position and allowed her to speak her truth. You may not agree with that truth, but that's what universities are for, is to represent the different sides. And when donors start getting in there and dictating, I'm with AJ. There's some thorny problems going on there, and you're always going to see me pushing against that. So whether or not you agree with her politics shouldn't dictate as to whether the information can be presented and whether she should have tenure. So, sorry. I think I'm going to just throw it to AJ for his next article.
That was quite the smoker there. Anyway, our next article is actually from Newshawk, and news is spelled Nooz. I don't know. Anyway, but it's a really good article. It's actually from Miss Sinclair. Is your nonprofit's gift acceptance policy clear, flexible, and up to date? So this is kind of a broader article on what a gift acceptance policy is and kind of things to think about when drafting one. So they give some examples. There is some gift donations that from the Shackler family. If people aren't aware of it, there was just a John Oliver, kind of deep dive into this on Last Week Tonight. And it's essentially the Shacklers were the people that were involved with the OxyContin manufacturing and marketing, and they wanted to give, and so they were trying to give charitable donations, and people are refusing to do so because of the optics of accepting that. So they kind of go through what your gift acceptance policy is in here. And so an art museum that turned this down from the Purdue Pharma Shackler family, it's probably an extreme example, and you probably won't find this all the time where somebody's public persona is going to, make it difficult for them to accept money from them I guess the gift acceptance policy that they're talking about here is a moderate approach. The quote is, first, remember that any money given to a nonprofit ultimately is for the good of society as a whole. And that's why nonprofits are deemed by the Internal Revenue Service to be a public benefit corporation. So it's just something to think about. Like, I think when you're drafting one of these, it's good to think about where, like the amount of money, the benefit it's going to perceive, but then the public perception and I guess, the public good behind it. So one example is that is if you're an environmental organization, there's a lot of oil money out there for remediation. Is it good to take that money from like an oil or gas company to remediate, or to help further the mission of like a carbon neutral kind of society? Or is that bad optics in your organization? Another one would be here in Oregon, we have like medical marijuana and legal recreational marijuana. Should, that kind of money or the proceeds from that tax go towards like addiction rehabs, nonprofits? Would that be a sticky situation if you are running like a nonprofit based around alcohol and addiction rehab? If you're taking marijuana money, essentially another legal drug, or even an alcohol or manufacturer. So it's things to think about. And then just from a pragmatic standpoint, what type of donations are restricted and how you restrict them and what you're going to accept, what's a threshold for donations being restricted. I've seen in the past organizations that have accepted like $500 endowment, restrictions where there's a lot of administrative work and investment work that goes on with a true endowment that's donor restricted. And if you're only taking $500 to start this endowment and have no plans to future add to it, that can add a lot of stress. So usually in these donor acceptance policies, what I've seen is it runs the gambit of what kind of grants, what the threshold is for a donation that should be restricted, and then what kind of items are acceptable to be. So I guess my questions to the group are: what are some things that nonprofits and boards should think about when accepting donations and gifts? I probably missed some here. And then what are your guys' experience with gift acceptance policies and any advice you'd give when drafting one?
Well, I'll go ahead and take it. So as far as your first question, some of the things to think about is, like you had mentioned, bad publicity. I thought the article was interesting to the fact that most people don't think that this is actually an issue. Most people just think, all these nonprofits, they'll just take any donations they can get, blah, blah, blah. But it makes you think about, what is, acceptable. And, your reputation is important as a nonprofit, especially if you're a big, well-known nonprofit. So, there's a fine line between the benefits to the public, and your mission versus, the reputation of the nonprofit organization. And as far as advice, maybe not so much leave it up to the board. Maybe take a survey of some of your large donors or some reoccurring donors that could help facilitate, your policy and help out to make better judgments. Mark, what do you think?
Yeah, Tony, I think you hit the nail on the head there with the mission, because I think that's what I was thinking as well. Like, is this donation in alignment with my mission and my values, right? Because your organization should have a defined mission for what you're trying to do and what you're trying to accomplish. And if it is not in alignment with that, that could be problematic. And some of the, I thought this article was great. And I recommended anybody, we're going to put some links down in the notes there, read this one. But I think there are some things I hadn't really thought about for some nonprofit boards I work on. And if you're getting cannabis funds, are you going to alienate more people than you're going to draw people in, right? Or is it a non-issue for people? I kind of, when I was reading this, I kind of was thinking about it in terms of politics, right? Because you always hear about these politicians that get money from all sorts of different sources. And then when it comes out that they've gotten money from maybe a questionable source, then they're quick to give the money back. And, I had no idea that this is what this person was doing. And, the Sackler family is certainly persona non grata right now, especially as they're trying to rewrite bankruptcy laws to shield themselves from any future liability. And people are completely turned off by this. So it doesn't surprise me that larger organizations are saying, no, that Sackler money, large as it is, we're not going to give them a get out of jail free card and help burnish their reputation as being good people just because they gave to our organization. Another thing that my mind thought of was, some of these museums who in the 60s and 70s had to really contend with whether they were going to take Nazi artifacts and Nazi art, right? Because it's a part of history, but do you want to glorify and have kind of a reputation for that's what this represents, right? So, there's there's a slippery slope between, Nazism and just a cannabis company, right? But these are all factors that need to be considered. And I think having a good policy, AJ and Tony both mentioned it, get clear with what your policy is and what your mission is so that you can decide, is this something we really want to accept at this time?
Yeah. And I think one thing that the article didn't touch on, but I think I'd like to put out there is the fact that, like, unlike a private business, nonprofit tax returns are accessible, or informational returns are accessible. And one of the things that you have to list on there are donors above a certain threshold, either $10,000 or I think it's 3% of your total revenue. And so often this isn't thought about until in hindsight, like when somebody uncovers that, oh my gosh, this addiction place got money, marijuana money. Is that really, should we really be taking that, for whatever reasoning that they're using? So I would think, just keep that in mind. Nonprofits are much more subject to kind of transparency in these issues and where they get their money from. And, it doesn't need to be just a large kind of donation. But one thing I was thinking about when I was reading this article too, and I'll pose this to the group here, is like, do you think that, an acceptance policy like this should cover all your bases? They talk about just the donation side of it and, getting individual donations. But I think just in my personal experience, you should probably have a policy that covers who you're getting grants from, who you're getting donations from, who you're getting, if you're getting business donations as well. And then we don't often think about in-kind donations as well, because those will hit your P&L or your statement of activities. So I think probably having a policy around, not just how you account for it, but the kind of limits that you set on those things and the strings that, that are you're willing to take with those donations versus the strings that are kind of a no-go zone should really be kind of looked at, I think, when you're putting these policies together.
Yeah. And again, I'll reiterate that, you want to follow your mission. You don't want to stray as far as what you accept or be blinded by generous offers and be leery of, the questionable donors. Like AJ said, a lot of it's public knowledge. You can find out, and sometimes it's just not worth taking a hit to your reputation.
Yeah, good article. Mark, you have our discussion topic for the week, I think.
Yeah, I think we're going to venture into some exciting territory this week. We're going to talk about the do's and don'ts of nonprofit risk management, right? Everybody's favorite topic, insurance. But not just insurance, but all sorts of types of risk management that you should consider. And risk management basically is a discipline for dealing with the possibility that some future event will cause harm to your organization, right? So it might be purchasing insurance, but it also might just be something like going around and doing an assessment of your organization, your facilities, et cetera, et cetera. So let's just jump into some do's and don'ts of risk management. I would say my first do is complete a risk assessment at least annually. And that's on all aspects of your business, not just a physical walkthrough, but I'm talking your cybersecurity, all these different aspects. So do complete a risk assessment at least annually. Somebody, who's next?
I got it. So I think to follow up on Mark's, I think another do would be kind of like in this annual review, you should probably do a health and safety check, and I would add on to that. This is a good time to review your controls. A lot of times, like a nonprofit in this risk management, I think what can fall under this umbrella is kind of reviewing your control environment as well. I think taking a look at like, not just like, and Mark kind of alluded to it, but there's physical, like on-site kind of risk, there's theft, and I think that would fall under your controls scheme, especially with this last year of COVID and kind of moving more digital and, having the pandemic. Reassess whether or not there's still controls in place and assess the risk given this new digital kind of remote work flow that most people have embraced. Is your cybersecurity up to snuff? So I think don't forget all those areas when you're doing your risk assessment, and kind of take a step back and make sure you haven't missed anything here. I think Mark listed some good bullet points, but physical on-site risk, theft, regulatory compliance, that's something we don't often think about, but knowing if you're in compliance with not only your 990 501c3 status, of a charitable donation, but also with your grants and programs that you're doing. Do you have a system in place to make sure that deadlines are being met for compliance items, reports and such, especially now that we're digital, or, now that we're more kind of remote, I guess. You're not in the office with a huge calendar on the wall to remind everybody of when due dates are. So, probably setting that up so that that's part of your risk assessment is really good. And then data security, we talked about it. I mean, how many, the uptick in phishing and ransomware and everything else, nonprofits can be a tidy kind of target if left unchecked, because you're accepting donations usually now through an online portal of some kind. Do you have secure, storage? Are you, are credit cards and names and phone numbers and email addresses correctly shielded from that kind of activity? It's something to think about, and I think it's something to put down on that risk assessment. Tony, what do you got for us?
One of the things was that we have on the do's list is ask employees what potential risks to see in the workplace. And as AJ mentioned, theft, I guess depending on the size and location of your nonprofit, people coming in and out, you may want to even put security cameras inside and out to prevent, people coming in and trying to steal from you, people coming in and trying to hurt somebody, people getting injured on your property. There's a lot of things to consider there.
Yeah, I also like the idea, bouncing off of what Tony was saying, with getting your employees' input, right? I've worked at a place that had health and safety committee where people would actually, from different departments, would walk around the building and walk around departments that weren't their own and kind of point out things that could be health and security risks that other people might not even see because they're just looking at the same thing day after day. So having, if you're a large enough organization, having a committee that makes these checks on a regular basis, maybe quarterly at least, and then having a staff handbook that lays out what the expectations are, right? Sometimes bad behavior just results from people not knowing what the expectation is, and bad behavior can get people injured. A lot of the reason we have rules and handbooks, is to protect the employee themselves from harm. AJ, what you got?
The one thing I think that we haven't mentioned yet is ensuring that you have the right type of insurance for these risks. Often director and officer insurance is kind of a given, but a lot of your risk assessment, you need to look at what your grants and contracts are requiring for as far as minimum insurance coverage, and making sure you're not over insuring, just because. I mean, insurance is expensive. But you need the right type of insurance. So I think having, often we talk about board members that would have an in, we think of lawyers, we think of CPAs. Often it's good to have somebody that's fluent in the insurance industry to be able, and not just a salesman, but somebody that's going to give you an honest opinion on what's viable, what's needed, and what type of insurance is needed, I think is really important. Because a lot of times, especially if you're moving from like a very small, like one program kind of nonprofit, and you're moving up in the world and you're adding more programs, and you're starting to contract with counties and state organizations or even federal organizations, they're going to have different insurance requirements than like when you were just operating as a grassroots kind of donation driven organization. So, as you're making those moves, and I think it's a real pin in, doing this yearly, or at least reviewing what you've done in years past yearly, to make sure that the organization hasn't grown enough where you're exposed to more risks than you were even 12 months ago. So, and making sure that you then have the coverage, the insurance coverage, and what that covers on the back end. If you have a physical location, do you have correct, building insurance? Do you have correct director and officer insurance? Director and officer insurance isn't usually that expensive, but it helps the board members feel protected, and then that there won't be personal liability to them, or if there is, it's covered under the insurance. So I think it's really important to review what your current insurance policies are and make sure that any of these risks that are listed in your risk assessment are either covered, mitigated, or, in some kind hedged against, a decent insurance policy that would cover those kind of things.
Yeah, I think I also want to talk a little bit about different types of risk assessment. I think that the insurance piece is really important that AJ was talking about. And there are different types of risks that you might have as a nonprofit, or B, just whatever sector you're in. So get familiar with what other organizations in your sector are doing, right? Because not one size fits all, even in nonprofit world. And, I'll give a specific example that I know of here in the state of Oregon. Unemployment insurance, right? Federally, you don't have to pay unemployment insurance. You don't have to pay FUTA if you're a nonprofit. But on a state level, some states, like the state of Oregon, allow you to self-fund your own unemployment insurance. That means that you're saving a lot of money up front, not having to pay out unemployment insurance premiums to the state. However, if something catastrophic happens, say a COVID type event, and all of a sudden you're laying off a lot of people, you have to pay the state back up to a certain amount for those unemployment claims when they come through. So make sure that you're making intelligent decisions and that you have well-informed people who are explaining to you the upsides and the downsides of making some of your decisions, because it's all about mitigating risk, right? You can hedge against risk, but you can't eliminate risk. And having insurance policies and making smart financial decisions is really the name of the game for an organization.
I might mention too, and just to piggyback off what Mark says, I think it's really important that, we talked about before about going to your board or having your board stacked with somebody that's knowledgeable in these areas. But I think nonprofits, especially, there's a vast wealth of knowledge sharing that happens in the nonprofit space. So whether that's, like Reddit r/nonprofits, or it's your local, kind of executive director group mingling that they have. I know we have a similar one in Oregon here in the Portland metro area where, there's kind of like a peer group of executive directors that get together and kind of, bounce ideas and kind of struggles and whatnot off each other. I think it's really healthy to be able to share these things and know that, your risk, especially when it comes to insurance, or we're talking about, unemployment insurance and such, isn't unique, I think. And I think regardless of the type of nonprofit you are, a lot of these risks are universal. You may have a few more if you're in the health and welfare, sector, or versus, you're a bicycle co-op or something. But, know that director and officer insurance, or, the overall, data security kind of security problems are universal. And it's nice to be able to bounce that stuff off of people and, get to know what other people have done, who their insurance carriers are, what kind of steps they've taken in these risk assessments, or to alert them to the fact that they need to do this. So I would just, really make a plea to everybody that's listening. If you're in the nonprofit sector, share that information with people. It's not giving away your secrets. It's making sure that other people don't fall into a trap and, good nonprofits go by the wayside because of some unmitigated risk.
Yeah. And I think just to put a bow on this topic, the last thing I'll mention is don't think that this won't happen to you. Don't just postpone and think, I'll get that insurance later. I'll get it next year when we have more money. You can't really plan for a catastrophe. And once the catastrophe happens, it's too late. So just make sure that you're not postponing this till tomorrow. I worked at an organization where we thought all of our data was being backed up, and there was a catastrophic cascading drive crash where we lost 2 years worth of financial data. We had some of it in printouts, but we had to recreate that. And it is a nightmare from which it took months to emerge. And there was stuff that you just couldn't get back. So you've got to be prepared. With cybersecurity and cyber, connection, you have to make sure you have proper backups in place and all of the different aspects of your business. Just consider it. Don't put it off till tomorrow. And I think that's where we'll leave that topic for today. And with that, I just want to thank everybody for joining us for another episode of Profitless on Purpose. We really appreciate you joining us here. Please visit us on YouTube and make some comments. Always can send us a tweet at Profitless Pod. Yeah, easy for me to say. And we enjoy engaging with you in the conversation, and we look forward to seeing you next time on the podcast.
Thanks, everybody.